This video is going to start with a trigger and a content warning. I only say this at the beginning of this video to try and be somewhat responsible, not to try and hype up just how horrible they probably are. Like, I genuinely believe these are some of the most distressing things that I've ever read and consumed, and if you're not in the best place for that, then please do not watch the rest of this video. But if you are here for some things that are generally gonna F you up and distress you, make you cry, make you nauseated, ruin your day, week, year, like these are like top tier, the worst, most upsetting books that I've had the misfortune of reading. If you're new here, my name is Charlotte. This is my channel, Charlotteshelves, and I try to upload fortnightly bookish related content. Today I have 8 of the most disturbing and obscene books that I have ever read, and each one of them is unique in that it covers something slightly different as to what makes it grotesque or upsetting or mentally scarring. I will be going in order of least but still horrendous to the most probably effed up book that I've ever read. So the first book I have is The Cement Garden by Ian McEwan. This is a literary fiction novella. This came to me in the first year of university. It was part of our required reading. It has stayed with me ever since. A brief plot summary. This documents the lives of 4 children who live quite an isolated existence, and they're being raised by a single mother, and the mother passes away and the children do not contact the outside world or any other adults. They instead try to deal with the body themselves by entombing her in cement in their basement. After their mother's passing, things start to get really dark and weird and macabre and grotesque. The children are trying to survive on their own. Like I said, they've got this very isolated existence, and it starts to pick up some really violent, grotesque themes. There is abuse, both physically and emotionally, and there are some really grotesque passages relating to incest between the children, and it's described kind of gratuitously. It's very nauseating. It's just a very depressing little book. Obviously it's touching on some really horrible taboos within it, and it just made me feel very sick and nauseated. But I just remember it being distressing, like really distressing to read, and without giving any more of the plot away or any spoilers, just a mildly traumatizing book. The next book I have is a slight change in tone, genre and subject matter. This is a true crime classic. It is The Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. This book documents the crimes and the killing spree of the Zodiac, who was active I think for about 68 to the mid-70s, predominantly around San Francisco in the Vallejo area. The Zodiac attempted to kill 7 people, 5 died, 2 survived, and he actually claimed to have killed more, like in the 30s. The author, Robert Graysmith, was actually writing at the San Francisco Chronicler at the time that the Zodiac was killing, and this is of interest particularly because the Zodiac was writing these cryptic notes to the police via the Chronicle, so he was sending the letters into the newspaper asking them to be published, and they were so distressing. This book perfectly encapsulates the hysteria, the fear, the terror of what it must have been like living in San Francisco in that area at the time. Graysmith's position at the paper just meant that he was really deeply entrenched with the other journalists, the writers and the police themselves, and he really had a front seat to what was going on. Graysmith breaks down each confirmed incident by the Zodiac quite cleanly. Like, the writing is very easy to read, it's very detailed, and I think one of the more distressing aspects of this book is that there are very violent and graphic descriptions of how each crime was committed and what happened to the bodies and the crime scenes by the Zodiac. There's almost a autopsy level of details, or post-mortem style of how these people died, so that's something to bear in mind, as it's brutal, still repulsive and stressful to kind of read about. Like, it's quite heavy going, but I really recommend it actually if you're into true crime. The next book I have for you is Tender is the Flesh. The concept of this, if you don't already know, is so grisly and fantastic and equally distressing. The level of detail for the bodily gore and the violence in this is quite unique, and I think it's definitely worth a read if you want something that's going to really mess with your head. This is a horror hybrid sci-fi / dystopian fiction, and it largely deals with the themes of cannibalism. This book follows a man named Marcos, and he works in a processing plant or a meat factory, except the meat is not animal flesh, it is human flesh. It is a dystopian fiction that is set in a future world in which an unnamed contagion has poisoned and ruined all animal flesh, therefore the only viable meat alternative is actually human flesh. We follow a very dark version of modern life through Marcus's eyes. His life is kind of depressing too, and we see how human beings are incarcerated and treated like animals are, basically animals that are raised for meat. I think if you aren't a vegetarian or you haven't done a lot of research into animal welfare, this might be quite shocking for you, because it is satirizing a lot of the treatment of animals and how we consume flesh. I don't think it's uncommon for human beings to think about how their meat perhaps gets from the farm to the table, and this goes into a lot of detail about that processing chain, but also how they are treating human beings. And there's a lot of torture and comments on, I would guess, capitalism, and there's some wider issues and some sort of satirical elements that make this quite grisly. It is certainly a book that I would not read eating my lunch at work, for example. It would make you feel quite gross. It can be a bit blunt and heavy-handed, and it's quite tell, not show. But I really actually enjoyed quite how grisly it was in certain aspects. Like, there are a couple of scenes that genuinely made me feel sick. It's one of the few books that I've read that covers cannibalism, and I would definitely read more by this author. She's actually got another book coming out in 2025 that I'm also looking forward to, and I found this to be a really effective, grotesque, brutal book. The next book I have is Make Room by Harry Harrison. This is a bit of a curveball compared to the others that I have picked, and let me explain why. I'm going to read you a quick quote that describes it. Harrison's novel of an overpopulated urban jungle, a divided class system operating with an atmosphere of riots, food shortages, and senseless acts of violence, and a desperate hunt for the truth by a cynical NYC detective, tells a classic tale of a dark future. This book was really upsetting because of how prescient it was, like how much it predicted the future and how much it probably will predict of our futures to come. So it was written in the 60s and I read it in the 2020s, and it deals with issues such as overpopulation, stifling weather conditions due to climate change, and the suffocating lack of basic resources for a lot of the population, and that polarity between those with money and those that don't have it is very heavily criticised in this. And then you have the upper classes living in these skyscrapers with aircon and fresh fruit and vegetables, and they're like a tiny 1% of the population that can afford to live within the awful weather conditions because the planet is dying. And it just gave a really bleak sort of future look at what society will probably be like in the not too distant future. Bleakness in it was just upsetting to read. It was making me feel quite choked and quite saddened about what will probably happen to the human beings in the future, what the next generation will probably have to go through as we see more and more effects from climate change. It triggered a deep amount of existential dread and anxiety in myself, and climate anxiety, and it was one of those books where I just felt really hopeless after reading it. I felt really morose. It had a very ominous, sort of oppressive tone throughout it, although you're kind of interested in the tiny little thriller detective narrative of this man just trying to solve crime while living in this kind of world. It's very intriguing. It's very stressful to read about what the planet will be like when it's on the cusp of its breaking point, when our last final resources are almost depleted, and that's kind of the context for this, and it is petrifying. Bear with me on this one and hear me out, because I have gone with, for my next book, Titus Andronicus by William Shakespeare. Titus Andronicus does not get enough press or hype or esteem or regard for it, and that is largely due to how violent and grotesque the subject matter that is in this play. I have read, I think, nearly all of Shakespeare's works, and to me this is the most nauseating and disturbing of anything he's ever put out there. A very brief plot summary is that there is a war. Titus Andronicus is a general in the war itself, and he brings back a queen from the losing side called Tamora and presents her as a wife to his boss, the emperor, and she is obviously unhappy with this. Her own children and sons have died in battle, as have some of Titus Andronicus's, and the sort of central agency or energy within this plot is that it is a sort of revenge tragedy, I would say. She wants to take revenge on Titus Andronicus. He similarly wants to take revenge on her and other characters in the book, and it is brutal. This book has a bit of everything in terms of torture, abuse, cannibalism, R-wording, if I can say that, fun with food, again in the form of cannibalism, and just a lot of physical and emotional abuse, psychological damage, torture, like trying to fit everything that happens, like every injury is just, oh. There is a reason this is not picked for your year 9 SATs or your GCSEs for you to study when you're like 14 to 16, because it is gory, because it would be the equivalent of a Saw movie if it was made today for like a modern or a contemporary audience. Tonally, it's the most unique out of all his works, I personally think. Like, I remember studying this both as an undergrad and for my postgrad stuff, and it to me is so different from the rest of his canon of works. Like, it just doesn't read like it's by him. To me, it doesn't feel like it's his voice. And again, like I said, this is co-written, but there's something about it that's so different to a lot of the other stuff. Like, I think if people have this misconception that Shakespeare is stuffy or inaccessible, maybe going with this, like, because this is brutal. Like, you will be engaged. There is so much going on constantly that is going to turn your head, make you sick, make you feel distressed. And there's one particular scene, and I'm just going to say one word, and if you know, you know, and that is Lavinia. Next book I have has stuck with me since I've read it, and it has gotten in my head and it has gnawed away at me like it did the people and the characters within the book itself. This is a particularly brutal horror book called The Troop by Nick Cutter. This is a sort of body contagion horror, and it is messed up. I'm going to quickly read you the plot summary from Goodreads because this one's pretty good and actually encapsulates what's going on. So a scoutmaster leads a troop of boys into the Canadian wilderness for a 3-day camping trip. It is a tradition, and it is meant to be comforting and reliable with things such as a good ghost story, but when an unexpected intruder, shockingly thin and disturbingly pale and voraciously hungry, stumbles onto their campsite, Tim and the boys are exposed to something far more frightening than any tale of terror: the human carrier of a bioengineered nightmare, an inexplicable horror that spreads faster than fear, and a harrowing struggle for survival that will pit the troop against the elements and the infected and one another. That plot basically tells you these big gold group of boys and their scoutmaster are out on a little island, and they aren't getting picked up by a boat until the end of the 3-day stay, and they don't have phones on them. There's no way they can communicate with the outside world. It's meant to be a traditional wilderness, get your badges kind of trip, and this person who is infected ends up on the island, and it has genuinely great writing, and I don't want to undermine any of the positives of it, but it's so fundamentally gross. Like, the disease and the contagion and how it is described and how it bodily affects the kids, well, not the kids, but the person that is infected, and then how that kind of spreads throughout the island. It is grim. So much to be said in a sort of post-COVID world about reading books that are to do with contamination and disease and contagion and plague, and I kept reading it, but it was horrible. The book that I have is actually a particular short story within a collection of short stories, and this is First Love, Last Rites, also by Ian McEwan, and it is a story within this collection called Butterflies, and it's very upsetting, and I wouldn't recommend this to anyone to actually read. This was another one that was recommended at uni when we were studying short fiction, and this is just the worst example of sort of abuse and grotesque things that I've ever read, and it's difficult for me to kind of talk about it. Very briefly, the plot follows a deranged, very kind of isolated male who is attracted to children, shall we say, and the plot is we are sort of through his eyes going about his day as he encounters a child and the interactions that he then has with that child. It's grotesque and if your mental health is anything less than perfect, like, don't go near it. Don't think, I'm curious, I'm gonna have a look and see what it's about. Like, it's so effing vile. It has a sort of didacticism to it in the sense that it reminds you that monsters aren't creatures of horns and scales and claws. They are everyday human beings that look like your uncle, your brother, someone in your family. They might look like your neighbor, and they are normal people that do horrible things, and it reminds you about the normalcy of monsters in human flesh suits, essentially. The story, as I said, is through the eyes of this offender, and it kind of attempts to humanize the violent and sadistic sexual behavior that is the deviance or whatever within his brain. You're almost complicit with what he is going through, and you're sort of traveling with him because it's first person through his nauseating little brain. I can't explain it any more than that. It makes you feel like you're part of that experience. It's so upsetting. So this is the worst book, or worst short story rather, worst anything that I have ever read. I've only kept this book because the other short stories in here are worthy of keeping and reading. He's a phenomenal novelist, and interestingly enough, most of his other books, apart from the 2 that I've mentioned today, are not at all like this, both in tone or subject matter. Like, he's an astounding novelist. He's one of my favourite writers of all time. But those 2 offerings that we were made to look at for university are just something else. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate this was a bit of a weird one for me to film. If you have read any other deeply disturbing books, leave me the recommendations in the comments because I will want to check them out. As you can tell, I do seem to read some stuff that is